Denise Williams smiled as she waved goodbye to her husband that December morning, never revealing that his best friend Brian Winchester was already waiting to make sure Mike Williams would never come home again. Mike Williams had everything a man could hope for. At 31, his life seemed almost too perfect to be real. He was successful, kind, and deeply rooted in his small Florida community. His career in real estate was thriving, and he had a reputation for being honest and hardworking. He lived in a tidy house by the lake with his high school sweetheart Denise and their little daughter, who had just celebrated her first birthday. On weekends, Mike liked nothing more than to take his boat out early in the morning, the fog still low on the water, and spend a few quiet hours hunting ducks with his best friend Brian Winchester. To anyone looking in from the outside, it was a picture of peace, a man living a simple, fulfilled life surrounded by people who loved him. The morning of December 16th began like any other winter day in Florida. The air was cool, the sky streaked with the first faint signs of dawn. Denise remembered Mike leaving the house just before sunrise, wearing his camouflage jacket and carrying his hunting gear. He told her not to worry, that he'd be home by lunch. He kissed her goodbye and drove away in his truck, the headlights cutting through the misty darkness. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. When Mike didn't return that afternoon, Denise grew anxious. By nightfall, she called Brian, who said he hadn't gone hunting with Mike that day after all. Panic quickly set in. Denise reported her husband missing, and by the next morning the search was underway. Boats scoured the lake, helicopters hovered overhead, and divers combed through the murky waters. They found Mike's truck parked near the boat ramp. His empty boat was discovered drifting not far from shore. Floating near the reeds were his waders and a hunting jacket. To everyone, it looked like a terrible accident. A man had probably fallen overboard and drowned in the cold water. As the days passed and no body was recovered, the mystery deepened. Friends gathered around Denise, offering comfort and prayers. Brian stood by her side, helping organize search parties and dealing with reporters. The local news covered the story extensively. The community mourned the man they believed had died doing what he loved. When the search was finally called off, authorities declared it a probable drowning, a tragic accident that left a young widow and her child behind. But for some, the story never felt quite right. The lake where Mike disappeared wasn't deep enough to swallow a body without a trace. Experienced hunters pointed out that Mike was careful on the water. He knew the risks better than anyone. His mother, Cheryl, refused to accept that her son was gone. She spent months writing letters to local officials, begging them not to close the case, convinced there was more to the story. Despite her pleas, life went on. Denise received the life insurance payout and tried to rebuild her life, or so it appeared. Brian checked in often, visiting the house to offer support. People thought it was touching that Mike's best friend stayed close, helping take care of the family. But Cheryl noticed how easily he fit into their lives, how comfortable he seemed in Mike's absence. The case slowly faded from the news, but not from memory. There was something about the way things had unfolded, the convenient timing, the missing body, the uneasy friendship, that never settled well with those who truly knew Mike. It was as if a piece of the puzzle had been deliberately hidden. What no one could imagine at the time was that the truth behind Mike's disappearance was darker than any of them dared to believe. Behind the smiles, the sympathy, and the perfect suburban calm, a secret was festering, one that would take nearly 2 decades to surface and expose the betrayal that had started on that quiet December morning. Months passed after Mike's disappearance, and the town slowly returned to its usual rhythm. People still spoke of him sometimes at church and grocery lines or during community gatherings, but the talk was fading. Denise, the grieving widow, appeared to be coping as best she could. She dressed neatly, attended church with her daughter, and thanked everyone for their prayers. She kept her emotions controlled, never breaking down in public, never revealing much about what she felt. To some, she seemed remarkably composed for someone who had lost her husband so suddenly. But grief wears many faces, and no one wanted to question a woman who had already suffered so much. Brian Winchester remained close to Denise through it all. He had been Mike's best friend for years, his fishing partner, his hunting buddy, and the man he trusted more than anyone. Now Brian was the one helping Denise with home repairs, errands, and the emotional weight of her new life. His wife Kathy noticed the late-night phone calls, the whispered conversations, and the unplanned visits. Whenever she asked, Brian explained it away. Denise needed support, he said. She was lonely, and he couldn't abandon her now that Mike was gone. It sounded noble enough, and for a while Kathy believed him. But the truth was far less innocent. Behind closed doors, Brian and Denise had grown closer than anyone imagined. What had begun as comfort between friends had slowly become something deeper, something forbidden. Their connection had existed long before Mike's disappearance, a secret that had thrived in stolen glances and carefully hidden moments. Now with Mike out of the picture, there was nothing stopping them. To the world, they were united in grief. In reality, they were united in guilt. Denise began to change in subtle but telling ways. She stopped wearing her wedding ring. She started spending weekends away from home, claiming to visit family. Her demeanor, once fragile, became calm and controlled. She sold the house she had shared with Mike and bought a new one in another neighborhood. The proceeds from his life insurance policy, nearly $2 million, made her financially secure. Friends said she seemed at peace, though no one could explain how she had healed so quickly. Brian, too, seemed changed. He was often restless, distracted, and easily angered. Guilt sat heavy on him, though he never showed it publicly. He told himself that what happened was necessary, that it had been an accident that spiraled out of control. He convinced himself that he had done it for love. Denise reassured him whenever doubt crept in. She told him they could start fresh, raise her daughter together, and build the life they had always wanted. Years passed, and their secret remained buried beneath layers of lies. Eventually, Brian divorced Kathy, unable to maintain the facade. Not long after, Denise and Brian made their relationship official. They married in a quiet ceremony, surrounded by people who thought it was a sweet ending to a sad story, a friendship that turned into love after tragedy. But beneath their smiles, the truth festered. The foundation of their marriage was not love, but betrayal. Despite their attempts to move on, shadows followed them. Denise avoided Mike's mother, who never stopped demanding answers about her son's disappearance. Cheryl Williams refused to believe that Mike had drowned, and every time she appeared on the news or contacted the police, Denise grew tense. She feared that one day the truth might resurface. Brian tried to calm her, but he too lived in fear of exposure. He had nightmares of that day on the lake, of the moment everything went wrong. As the years went on, cracks began to show in their perfect facade. The spark that once held them together dimmed. The guilt that once united them now separated them. What had started as a forbidden romance born out of deception began to turn into something darker: resentment, paranoia, and mistrust. Neither could fully escape the memory of what they had done. They had taken a life, built a future on lies, and convinced themselves they had gotten away with it. But guilt has a way of resurfacing no matter how deep it's buried. And for Brian and Denise, the past was far from finished with them. 15 years had passed since Mike Williams vanished into the cold waters of Lake Seminole, and for most people his story had become a local legend, a strange accident that time had turned into rumor. The lake, the search, and the grief had all faded into memory, but for those closest to him, especially his mother Cheryl, the pain never dulled. She never believed her son drowned. Every year on his birthday, she sent letters to law enforcement begging them to reopen the investigation. Most of those letters went unanswered. It seemed no one wanted to dig up the past anymore. Denise and Brian, however, could never fully escape it. Their marriage, once built on secrecy and passion, had grown cold and bitter. The guilt that had once bound them now tore them apart. Denise became controlling, cautious, and distant. She demanded perfection from Brian, pushing him to maintain the image of a respectable couple. He obeyed at first, but resentment simmered beneath the surface. Their shared crime had turned into a silent battlefield of blame. Whenever Denise looked at him, Brian saw judgment in her eyes. Whenever he spoke, she saw weakness in his words. Money and comfort couldn't erase what they had done. Brian began drinking heavily, haunted by the image of Mike struggling in the water that morning. He had convinced himself years ago that he'd done what was necessary, but in the quiet moments when the world went still, he felt the weight of it crushing him. Denise, on the other hand, had grown colder over the years. She rarely spoke of Mike, rarely mentioned the past, and lived as if she could will away her sins through silence. To everyone around her, she seemed composed, even successful. She attended church, raised her daughter, and kept her life neatly in order. But behind the facade, fear was always there. Fear that Brian might one day lose control and tell someone the truth. That fear became reality in the summer of 2012. Their marriage had deteriorated beyond repair, and Denise wanted out. She told Brian she was leaving him, cutting him off financially and emotionally. Brian, already unstable, couldn't handle the rejection. He believed he had sacrificed everything for her, even his best friend's life. Now she was walking away as if none of it mattered. His anger turned to obsession. He began following her, calling her repeatedly, and showing up at her workplace. Denise filed for divorce, and the separation became bitter and public. Then came the breaking point. In August 2016, Brian lured Denise into his car under the pretense of reconciliation. Once she was inside, he pulled a gun and held her hostage. He drove for hours, ranting about betrayal, love, and fear. He begged her not to leave him, telling her she was all he had left. Denise, terrified but calculating, managed to calm him down enough to escape when he stopped for gas. She ran for help, and police quickly arrested Brian. The kidnapping shocked everyone. The once respectable man was now behind bars, accused of holding his wife at gunpoint. For investigators, the case raised old questions. Why had Brian Winchester, the man who was with Mike Williams on the day he disappeared, suddenly snapped? Why was Denise Williams, the supposed grieving widow, now the target of her husband's rage? The strange circumstances rekindled interest in Mike's disappearance. Detectives began to look deeper into the case, piecing together inconsistencies that had long been ignored. As Brian sat in jail awaiting trial, the weight of his past began to crush him. Years of guilt, fear, and paranoia finally caught up. He knew he was facing a long prison sentence, and he also knew Denise had no intention of helping him. The woman he had killed for had turned her back on him completely. With nothing left to lose, Brian began to talk. What he confessed to investigators would unravel one of Florida's most chilling secrets. A story not of accident or misfortune, but of deliberate betrayal, greed, and murder. For the first time in 15 years, Mike Williams was no longer a mystery. The truth was finally about to surface, and it was darker than anyone had ever imagined. When Brian Winchester finally broke his silence, investigators braced themselves for what they thought would be a story of negligence or an accidental shooting. What they heard instead was something far more chilling, a murder planned long before that cold December morning. Brian sat in the interrogation room, his hands trembling, eyes hollow. After years of silence, the truth poured out like a confession he could no longer keep buried. He told them everything, how he and Denise had plotted Mike's death, how greed and desire had driven them to destroy a man who trusted them completely. The plan, according to Brian, had begun months before Mike's disappearance. Denise had grown restless in her marriage. She wanted the freedom to be with Brian and the money from Mike's life insurance, but she didn't want the shame of divorce or the risk of losing custody of her daughter. She convinced Brian that if Mike were gone, they could have everything, a life together, wealth, and no obstacles. Brian admitted that he hesitated at first. Mike had been his best friend since childhood, but Denise was persuasive. She told him she would never leave him, that they were meant to be together and that this was the only way. On the morning of December 16, 2000, Brian said he picked Mike up before sunrise. They loaded the boat and drove out to Lake Seminole. Mike was cheerful, unaware that his best friend had a gun hidden beneath the gear. The plan was to stage an accident. Brian would push Mike into the water, let him drown, and then make it look like a hunting mishap. The insurance money, over $1 million, would go to Denise. Everything was supposed to be quick, simple, and untraceable. But things didn't go as planned. When Brian pushed Mike into the lake, Mike panicked and started swimming toward the boat. He was wearing waders, but they didn't pull him under as quickly as Brian expected. Instead, Mike fought to stay afloat, calling out for help. In that moment, Brian realized the plan was falling apart. If Mike survived, he would know what Brian had done. Panic took over. Brian raised his shotgun and pulled the trigger. The sound echoed across the still water. Mike's body went limp and the ripples faded into silence. Brian dragged Mike's body back onto the boat and stared at him for a long time, numb and shaking. The man who had once been his closest friend now lay dead at his feet. He wrapped the body in a tarp and drove to a remote area in Jackson County, where he buried Mike in a shallow grave near a swamp. Days later, he returned to move the remains when construction threatened to expose the site, digging a deeper hole to ensure no one would ever find it. Afterward, Brian met with Denise. She didn't cry. She simply asked if it was done. When he nodded, she hugged him and whispered that everything would be okay now. Together, they carried on the lie. Denise played the grieving widow, Brian the supportive friend. No one suspected a thing. They collected the insurance money, split it, and went on with their lives as though Mike had never existed. As Brian told his story, detectives listened in stunned silence. Every detail matched the inconsistencies they had found years earlier. The odd position of the boat, the missing evidence, the strange calm Denise had displayed after the supposed accident. When Brian led investigators to the burial site, they unearthed the truth at last. Human remains, identified through DNA, confirmed what Cheryl Williams had always believed. Her son had been murdered. The revelation sent shockwaves through Florida. The story that had once been labeled a tragic accident was now exposed as a calculated murder, born from greed and betrayal. Denise was arrested shortly after, charged with conspiracy, insurance fraud, and first-degree murder. In court, her expression remained cold, her voice steady, as the jury listened to the horrifying details of how she and Brian had plotted Mike's death. For years they had fooled everyone. They had built their lives on lies, living comfortably while the man they killed lay buried in the mud. But the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface no matter how deeply it's hidden, and when it finally emerged, it destroyed everything they had left. The courtroom was silent as Denise Williams walked in, her face expressionless, her eyes fixed straight ahead. The woman who had once been seen as a grieving widow now stood accused of conspiring to murder her husband for money and love. Reporters filled the room, capturing every moment of the trial that had become one of the most talked-about cases in Florida's history. On the witness stand, Brian Winchester sat with slumped shoulders, his voice steady but broken as he retold the story of how he had killed Mike Williams and how Denise had planned every step. His words painted a picture of cold calculation, a woman who had traded her husband's life for freedom and wealth. The jury listened to the evidence. The insurance documents signed just months before Mike's death, the phone records between Denise and Brian, the timeline that fit too perfectly to be coincidence. Prosecutors described Denise as manipulative and greedy, a woman who had used love as a weapon to convince Brian to do what she could not. When her defense argued that Brian had acted alone, the jury saw through it. His confession had been too detailed, too consistent with the evidence unearthed after so many years. Denise's calm demeanor did not help her case. She never showed remorse, never shed a tear, as if emotion might betray the truth she had hidden for so long. Outside the courtroom, Cheryl Williams waited quietly through each session. For nearly 2 decades, she had fought to prove that her son hadn't drowned. Every petition, every letter, every unanswered phone call had led to this moment. She sat in the front row during the verdict, clutching a small photograph of Mike as a boy, her hands trembling. When the jury announced Denise's conviction, Cheryl finally exhaled. Justice, though long delayed, had arrived. It wasn't joy she felt, but relief. A painful acknowledgement that her son's story had been heard at last. Brian received a life sentence for the murder. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars, haunted by the crime that had consumed him. Denise was sentenced for her role in the conspiracy, her freedom taken just as easily as she had once taken Mike's. As she was led away in handcuffs, her face remained unreadable. The woman who had once smiled for the cameras as a grieving wife now disappeared from public view, a prisoner of her own choices. The story of Mike Williams spread far beyond Florida. True crime programs, documentaries, and podcasts retold the case, each one unraveling the layers of deceit that had fooled an entire community. People were stunned by the idea that someone could plot such evil while appearing so ordinary. It became a tale not only of murder but of betrayal, the kind that cuts deepest because it comes from those closest to us. Mike's death was not the work of a stranger lurking in the dark, but of the 2 people he trusted most, his wife and his best friend. In the years that followed, Cheryl turned her energy toward helping other families of missing persons, determined to make sure no one else's cries for justice went unheard. She visited Mike's grave often, bringing fresh flowers and talking to him softly about how his daughter had grown up. Though the pain never left her, there was peace in knowing the truth was no longer buried beneath lies. The quiet suburb that once whispered about the tragic accident now spoke of betrayal and greed. Mike Williams's story became a warning, a reminder of how far people will go when love turns to obsession and loyalty turns to deceit. What began as the disappearance of a kind, hard-working man ended as one of the most haunting tales of manipulation and murder. Even years later, those who heard it couldn't shake the thought that betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. Sometimes it comes from the ones who smile at you across the dinner table, the ones who say they love you, the ones you would never imagine could be holding the plan to your destruction.